you've been following Mike now for some time. The timing of this, obviously, when you planned to write this book, you looked off in the horizon a couple of years ago and said, okay, I'm going to deep dive on this stuff. I thought it was so sad on a golf cart with his longtime wife, Mickey, having lost to North Carolina for the second time in a month. God, Ian, it was so anticlimactic. It was just such a thud. So I'll start with that. He could not figure out North Carolina's riddle. How disappointed was he immediately after the game?
Oh, I mean, he was as disappointed as you could be. And it was interesting. He said, I don't think I've ever heard a coach say this. In his locker room after the game, the devastation was so profound that everyone was crying. And he said that was a beautiful sight. And I never heard a coach describe that scene that way and after a devastating defeat. And I understood what he meant, and he explained it, that was proof that his kids cared so much about the effort and the result. And either they're going to be tears of great joy or tears of great sadness. And unfortunately, they were on the wrong end of that. But at least there were tears throughout the locker room. And that told him that what I think he already knew about this group, because honestly, Colin, 5 minutes left against Michigan State in round 2, down 5, we all thought they were losing.
Yep.
Just watching that team this year 35 times and even talking to some of the Duke beat writers, everyone thought they were losing because they had not shown that toughness in end game tense situations. And they grew up in real time for him. And I think they gave him a gift. That game, the Texas Tech game, the Arkansas game, that as much as last night really hurt, and it really hurt, that he understood that they did give him a gift and they got him to the Final Four for a 13th time, passing John Wooden. He was never obviously going to catch Wooden with 10 national titles, but this group got him past John Wooden for Final Four appearances. And I think he can't really fully repay them for that. And he understood that as well.
Well, Carolina's playing better now.
Mm-hmm.
Kansas is probably better now. And Villanova, if fully healthy, would give them the fight of their lives. So, what makes college basketball so unique, I don't know how these people can bet the final March Madness. In the NBA, if I'm watching a playoff game and I've got James Harden and Embiid on the floor, those are refined artists. I know the product I'm getting. Now, they may have a bad shooting night or get into foul trouble. I'm watching college basketball. Ian, these kids are they're like our own kids. You see them grow up in front of your eyes. Like, you can see their confidence build, their confidence erode. Can you explain Carolina? Because you've had to cover Hubert Davis a couple times during the work for your book. He was a very, very gracious man as a player, was never a self-promoter. I don't know if people thought he was a great choice. Obviously, as an 8 seed, it was a very turbulent season. What do you make of what he's done with this program?
Well, and I talked to Jeff Van Gundy, who was an assistant on that Knicks team in '94. If we recall, in the Eastern Conference semis, the Knicks beat the Bulls in 7. That was the year Michael Jordan was playing baseball. And game 5, Hugh Hollins makes that call. Bulls are up 1, about to take a 3-2 series lead. They were going to beat the Knicks in game 6 in Chicago without question in that series and eliminate them. And Hubert Davis gets the call, top of the key jumper. It was probably a bad call by Hugh Hollins, the official. Pippen grazed his arm after the release. That should not have been called, but it was. But Davis then had to go to the line and make those 2 free throws. At the time, they were 2 of the biggest foul shots in the history of that Knicks franchise. And he had only been on the floor for 13 minutes. He had not been to the line that night, and he sank those 2. And it's been largely forgotten because of the Hugh Hollins call. And Jeff said that that's who he was. He was so professional, never lost his poise. Just even on the road, he did not want a room next to Knicks who were loud and out all night. And he wanted professionalism at all times. So Van Gundy told me, I'm not surprised that when it looked like they wouldn't even make the NCAA tournament, he stayed with it. He worked the problem, and he never lost his poise. And I think that group fed off that. And I felt going into that game last night, if Love had a big game, Duke would be in trouble. I thought he was the difference. Obviously, he was the difference last night in the game with 28 points. And I just felt that, I mean, they're a hot team. We've seen this before in the NCAA tournament, where if you just get hot at the right time, and I think of, I don't know, Villanova 85 and some other teams in the tournament, of course, Valvano's team that won it all in 93, that there's a magical part of that. And I think he's tapped into that. And one thing I noticed last night, I was sitting courtside 3 rows back, right across from the Carolina bench. He was so intensely engaged in every possession.
Yeah.
He did not take one possession off. And I looked across the floor and I saw Krzyzewski sitting on the stool. And I hate to say it, but it did at times look like a younger guy coaching against an older guy.
Yeah.
And you can credit Mike for sort of not overreacting to every bad bounce that he got. But it really seemed like Hubert Davis just would not let one possession go. The refs constantly warned him to back down a little bit, to temper his approach. He didn't really listen to them. And I don't know, I think that might have been worth a couple of points to Carolina. Just the way, I've never seen him so animated in my life, but I think it worked last night, and it worked in a big way.
Well, isn't it ironic that the first couple times that Mike Krzyzewski, who Duke fans doubted as a hire, faced the legendary Dean Smith,
right?
It was the feisty Krzyzewski sort of making an unforgettable comment, as you talk about in your book, when Dean Smith walks down before the first game is over, they ever play. And Mike says, "Hey, the game's not over, Dean." And here we have a hire by Carolina and Hubert Davis. Again, not a flashy guy, not a big name. A lot of the Tar Heel fans this year, highly passionate, high standards, doubting him. And it's Hubert Davis that sort of puts an imprint on this game, because as I read that from you about working the officials, I always felt of the 2 or 3 things that Krzyzewski was known for, to be honest with you, it wasn't his offensive genius. It was working the officials. People always said it. Duke indoor, he was getting 6 points a night. He literally was berating, voicing his opinion. I think it's interesting that Hubert is such a dichotomy of personalities between Hubert Davis and Mike Krzyzewski. But I guess my point is, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Here's Hubert Davis, the passionate fan base questions if he's the right hire, and he's moving on. Do you think, Hubert Davis is having an 8 seed in this run? Do you think Carolina can match that sort of intensity against Kansas? I have this feeling that Kansas was just licking its chops late in this game, Ian, thinking, listen, this is a prize fight. This is Frazier Ali. We get the next fight. I don't know if Carolina can match that.
I mentioned to someone last night, you made a great point, and I'm kicking myself now for not having a line in my column for the New York Post about how Hubert Davis was very much like a young Krzyzewski in that game. It was almost like the older Mike Krzyzewski got beaten by his younger self.
Yeah.
And he was I can't overstate. I've been to a lot of games, pro and college, and seeing coaches make a difference. Just how every single possession, he was right in the fight. And it did remind me of a young Coach K. But yeah, and without question, I think that, Hubert Davis, I think people looked at his persona and wondered whether or not he had the fire to have a performance like that last night, or to lead a team, and a team that struggled. And I asked Krzyzewski the other day about that, and just what impressed him the most about when it looked like Carolina wouldn't even make the NCAA tournament, how Hubert kept that group together. And he said it was just his poise, that he was always impressed by his poise, just like Jeff Van Gundy said as a player in the 90s with the Knicks. And he also said he never tried to be like Dean Smith or Roy Williams. You could tell he's being true to himself.
Yes.
And obviously, if you're not that, players will see through it. And I mentioned to someone last night that, unfortunately, the late, great Herb Brooks is no longer with us. But Hubert Davis could use him tonight to say, we cannot lose to Finland. If we lose to Finland after doing what we did in the semifinal, you will take this to your graves, right? Herb Brooks told his players that in 1980. And I don't want to compare Kansas to Finland, but there's a little bit of that sense, because to knock out Coach K in his final game, obviously it's your blood rival next door, and to win that game is so emotional. That place, I've been in the Superdome many, many times for NFL games. I was there for the 93 Final Four, the Chris Webber timeout that he didn't have. I've never felt that place just felt so much bigger and louder to me than I've ever remembered it. And I think the game made it that way. And to now then come back 48 hours later and play Kansas, where there's some history between North Carolina and Kansas, obviously, but not like North Carolina and Duke.
Right.
It's going to be tough, but I would not put anything past the Tar Heels and Hubert Davis at this point. In fact, if you told me I had to put $20 on it, I'd put it on Carolina.
Yeah, recency bias is a powerful thing, but as I watched that game, I thought, I know college basketball culturally is different now. The players leave. It's more of a airport tarmac. You're just ready to get on the next flight. That was as good a college basketball game as I remember watching. I mean, it felt like I was watching Kentucky and Christian Laettner, the turnaround jumper at the free throw line. I mean, it felt that magnificent. And and again, it's a powerful part of what we do for a living is you fall in love with the moments. But that David Tyree catch in the moment and that David Tyree catch, 20 years later, it felt huge in the moment. I'm watching history. This makes no sense. Who's David Tyree? When I watched that last night and the back and forth nature of it, I almost got sick watching the Duke player Williams miss free throws.
Oh, he's a good model for student athletes in college sports. I mean, he was the wrong guy for that to have happened to. He gets it. He's thoughtful. He's a really good player. I think he'll be a good pro and just a great representative for college sports. And I hated that it happened to him. And he had come out for all the press conferences during the NCAA tournament, pre and post game. And I was with Duke in South Carolina, in San Francisco, and then, of course, last night in New Orleans. And he didn't come out after the game. And I'm sure it was Duke protecting him a little bit. Yeah. And Banchero came out and Wendell Moore. And that's fine. I mean, he's not a professional athlete. I think he probably would have handled himself with grace in that situation. But I would say the other game, I was at the Laettner game in Philadelphia in the Spectrum. And both teams played at such a high level. And that's still probably the best basketball game I've ever covered. I would maybe put this one right with it. The other one is UNLV in 91 in the semifinals when Duke beat them.
I was there.
And you were there. And I remember flying in. I know you had a relationship with that Vegas program in Tarek, and I was on the Vegas plane flying into Indianapolis. I sat next to Tarek for about 20 minutes on that flight, and he was worried about Laettner, and I thought he was just saying that, but he said, we have nobody to cover him, and it turns out he was right. The one, I don't know if I would put that game in the same category with Duke, Kentucky, and Duke-UNC last night, because Vegas didn't play to the highest level in that game. If they had and Duke prevailed, I'd feel differently about it. It was the greatest moment in Coach K's career in a lot of ways, but I don't think UNLV played at a very high level, so I wouldn't put it with the other two games.
Yeah, Stacey Augmon struggled. I believe Greg Anthony got into foul trouble. If I recall, that team, Grant Hill was a freshman the year before. Remember, UNLV won the year before in Denver.
By 30, by 30.
I think Allah Abdul Nabi may have been on that team, if I recall. Again, this is years and years ago. Then the next year, they faced those same guys. The difference was Laettner and Hurley were better, and Grant Hill was a freshman. I think I'm right on that, Ian.
You're right. Yeah, absolutely.
We didn't know much about him, and that was really the difference. So John Scheyer, we have a long history of a legendary coach picking his successor, and it capsizes a program for the short term. Scheyer's mid-30s, from Illinois, solid player. What do we know about him? You tell me, was this absolutely completely handpicked, or did the administrators at Duke feel this was a year out the right choice?
Well, it was amazing for me personally. It was like a full circle moment last night. I'm sitting there watching some of the first game, Kansas Villanova, and I get a text from somebody telling me that Tommy Amaker is sitting right behind me. And Tommy Amaker, if you recall, was in my book and in the excerpts that came out, that the university offered the job to him first, and that had not been reported previously. And that caused a great stir on campus and around college basketball. In fact, I was told that Coach K ultimately reached out to him. They had a conversation after my excerpt ran in the New York Post and then on ESPN as well. But Amaker was sitting directly behind me, and I ended up having a chat with him, and it was pleasant. But the university wanted him, and Coach K wanted Scheyer. And for the first time ever, Coach K and Duke were opponents. And guess what? Coach K won. That's what he usually does, right? He didn't last night, but he's won 1,202 times as a Division I head coach. So he got his way. He got Shire in there. I think John will do a very good job. I think he'll be there a long time if he wants to be. I really do. He went out of the gate and signed the #1 recruiting class in the country. So it's hard to argue with that. So he'll get talent. Chris Carrawell told me, and Carrawell is also the associate head coach at Duke and was on the wrong end of probably the worst berating that Coach K ever gave a Duke player. But their relationship came full circle. He's on the staff. And he said, listen, John Shire can recruit African-American players. I've seen him build relationships with those players and their families, and he gets it. And I think he's going to do a tremendous job. You said he was a solid player. I believe you said solid or something to that effect. He was better than that. I mean, John would have played in the NBA for a while. What happened was he averaged 20 on that national championship team. He was pretty much the best player on that team. And he was going to play with LeBron James in Miami, and he got a serious eye injury. But I think he would have been an NBA player for 6 to 8 years. And so he was good. He was a good player, and I think he relates well to all players and prospects. And if he can recruit the way he showed he can out of the gate, maybe he'll be there 25, 30 years. I'm not saying 42, but he is the same age basically that Coach K was when he took the job in 1980. So I suspect that he'll end up being the right choice. I'm not a huge fan of getting involved or Coach K getting involved when the university wanted somebody else, particularly somebody who had a great relationship with Krzyzewski and Tommy Amaker. But if you told me at the end of the day, Shire will ultimately do a better job than Amaker would have, I wouldn't have a problem with that.
Yeah. I'll tell you, the ratings have been fantastic for it. I'm a huge NBA fan. I grew up with my Sonics and my Portland Trail Blazers in the Pacific Northwest. I think the league has normalized stars missing games since Adam Silver took over. I think it's discouraging. I said as a prelude to your interview that when I was a kid living 2 hours from Seattle, going to a Sonics game and not getting Jack Sikma in downtown Freddie Brown would have broken my heart. I don't love seeing so many stars miss games. But instead of focusing on that, I do think college basketball, we were starved for it. And there is something to be said that, the NBA has always almost been an opponent of college basketball, whereas college football and the NFL really work well together. The NBA doesn't like college basketball. They create the G League. It's not a secret that Adam Silver is not a fan of college basketball or the NCAA. Do you think this has sustainability beyond this year and this year's ratings? Or do you think the Coach K story itself was the key to what has been one of the more memorable March Madness events in our recent memory?
That's a really good question. And I think a lot of it, Colin, was just seeing fans in buildings and obviously in those college atmospheres, the passion of the fan. Last year, we didn't have that. And frankly, being there last night in the Superdome with 71,000 people, it felt good. And I think the players fed off that. I think it made for much better TV to see packed college arenas. I don't know. I like college basketball better in the 80s and early 90s when you saw 3 and 4 year players. Going to the Big East tournament was my favorite event pretty much every year to cover in New York. And when you had Ewing and Mullen for 3-4 years going at each other, and you saw rivalries and relationships develop. And what you're seeing now in college basketball, there's an age gap too. And the older teams do have an advantage against younger, more talented opponents. That's fascinating to me. Carolina was a little, and in some spots, a lot older than Duke. And I do think that's a difference. I think 1 or 2 years alone makes a difference, never mind 3 or 4. Now, Duke was talented enough to get past some of those older teams. But Manick, who had a tough game for most of that game last night, comes up with a big block of Banchero.
Yep.
And then, of course, that huge three. If he were, what is he, 23 years old? If he were 18, 19, I'm not sure he would have survived those early struggles in that game.
Yep.
And that was a big block of Banchero, who didn't really do much late in that game. And then making the shot when he was frustrated early, his shots weren't falling, making that three. was everything. So I think that's where age can make a difference in these big games.
Yeah, the difference between a 55 and a 56-year-old, right, is much different than the difference between a 23-year-old and a young 21-year-old. We see this in youth sports. You go to and look, the younger you go, the singular year becomes more impactful. And I think a part of what makes Villanova so viable is they don't get 5-star guys. They often have, like Gillespie, no scholarship offers. He plays forever. That really is the secret sauce to Villanova, which is we got 23-year-olds, you got 19-year-olds. And let me tell you something, their ability to form chemistry. You've seen that with Villanova in the tournament. They're never the most vertical team. They often lack size. Their chemistry, the cohesiveness, their fight is so palpable as a viewer. So I want to segue to this because
if I could jump in there real quickly about Villanova too. I picked them for the Final Four. My wife thought I was crazy. She, by the way, met you at a book signing in New Jersey. She's a big fan of yours. And so she said, "What, Villanova?" I said, "They've got a great coach and they've got a great college point guard. He's not going to be a great pro point guard." Yeah. But when you have those two things in the NCAA tournament, usually good things will happen. But you're right, in recruiting, it's almost these days, you don't necessarily want the one and done guys. You want the best of that second tier,
yes,
who are really good, but not good enough to go to the pros before, say, 3 years. That's the recruit you want. I think that's the recruit Villanova gets.
Yeah, and by the way, it feels like, and I don't follow college basketball recruiting, it feels like Carolina at the end of Roy's run, he was getting some of those older players that you're like, I don't know, they'll play overseas. They don't feel maybe a deep second round guy. But I think to your point, I think Carolina, the age, it matters. And it's been wonderful so far. I'm not sure who I like. By the way, this will air Monday morning. I'm not sure who I like tonight. I've got to ask you one Tiger Woods question. He's gone from can't walk to may play at the Masters over the course of about 6 months. Your gut feeling this morning, if we see Tiger this weekend?
So he's got to make the cut. I thought you were going to
No. Will he play?
Yes. And listen, he's got a Tuesday press conference scheduled at 11 a.m. Eastern, and he's scheduled to practice today, Monday. He practiced Sunday at Augusta, and I think he'll play 9 holes today, maybe 18, who knows, but probably 9. And absolutely, at this point, there's no way he even last week would have shown up at Augusta National to practice if he wasn't planning on playing. Now, if he wakes up Thursday morning and all of a sudden out of the blue, his leg is killing him,
right?
Then I guess, but no, he's playing. And now whether or not he'll make the cut, listen, he's never entered a tournament in his life that he didn't expect to win. He doesn't expect to win this Masters, but I believe deep down he thinks he has a shot. Right. So he'll never enter a tournament where he feels he has no shot. So I think he must believe he's got a little bit of a shot to pull this off. Ben Hogan, of course, did it in 16 months, nearly got killed by a Greyhound bus. 16 months later, he wins the U.S. Open. Tiger's talked about Hogan and that comeback as the greatest in the history of golf and maybe in the history of sports. This is now 13 months and change. So if he could somehow contend, which may seem unlikely, and which may seem really improbable, win, then he out Hogan's Hogan. Now, I mentioned that in column. I got a lot of blowback from older fans who said, listen, Ben Hogan almost died getting hit by a Greyhound bus that swerved into his lane. You can't compare that to a self-inflicted crash or rollover. And we don't know all the details really right. of where Tiger was and was he asleep. So I've gotten that from some older fans, and I sort of brushed that aside. To me, hey, the guy came back from nearly having his leg amputated in after a crash 13 plus months ago. If he somehow contends, that's going to be one of the greatest golf stories of all time.
Listen, his last Masters win was, I've said this, it's one of the seminal golf memories of my life. We've all got the Norman at the Masters. We've got Tiger and that Rocco Mediate playoff to me at the U.S. Open. Tiger's win at the Masters last time was one of the few times. I always try to consider myself sort of a judge. The fans are the jury, the participants are the DA and the prosecuting attorney, and I'm just a judge, right? I was so emotional watching that. And so, I mean, I don't know if you can top it. Do you remember his last Masters win? What stuck out to you?
Oh, yeah. I think I've been doing this 36, 37 years. It's the greatest sporting event I've ever covered.
Wow.
And partly because my brother, it was my last trip with my brother. I never got a Masters ticket until that's the first time I ever got a Masters ticket. That was the 20th one I covered. And I gave it to my brother. So he had never been to a major before. So we go, and there we had a point blank look at the 16th green at the putt that basically sealed it. And we're walking to the 17th tee. And I said, Dan, you've never seen a major golf championship. You are now watching the greatest Masters of all time. And unfortunately, unexpectedly, he died months later. So it was our last trip together. So I admit that's part of why it's, to me, the greatest sporting event. But I think even if you took that away, and boy, I wish I could, that would still be number one. It's just remarkable to see him win after what he had endured. And again, some of it was, if not a lot of it, was self-inflicted. But I choose to look at the art and the artist and sort of separate and put it in its own category and box and appreciate the greatness. And then to see him hug his son afterward, I was really close to that moment. After, obviously, in '97, being there when Earl hugged him, it was, man, it's hard to beat that.
It is. Ian O'Connor, such great insight. I absolutely love that you're going to be a regular for the volume. From a basement, an undisclosed location. This is how Dick Cheney lived when he was in the White House. We never knew where he was exactly, but it was in a basement somewhere in D.C. It's great seeing you.
You too, Colin. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.